Algebra 1, Lesson 74. We are looking at absolute value equations and seeing how to solve those, how we get a couple different answers for those. So an absolute value equation is more absolute value expressions. So when we look at these, we are looking at, we can have simple ones like the absolute value of x equals 4, meaning if I have a value here for x, that distance to 0 is 4 units away. So it would mean that x would have to be either 4 or negative 4 in order to be 4 units away from 0. So when we do something like the absolute value of x equals 7, that means that a certain value has to be 7 units away from 0. Well, that would mean that both 7 or negative 7 would be answers. Meaning that what we're actually doing is looking at this inside value and saying, well, x then could be 7 or x could be negative 7. Taking what's inside of those absolute value signs and saying, what are the couple options here that give me a distance of 7? So that when we look at something like these, the absolute value of x minus 2 is equal to 6 and absolute value of x minus 2 is equal to 10, we can say, well, I know that the distance has to be 6, meaning that x minus 2 could either be 6, okay, that's one possibility for that distance, has to be 6, or x minus 2 has to be negative 6. So that we can solve each of these to say, well, x, when I solve, I add 2 to each side and get x is equal to 8, or x is equal to negative 4. So those are my two possibilities, and when we plug them in, we see, yes, 8 minus 2 is 6, so the absolute value of 6 is 6, and negative 4 minus 2 is negative 6, and the absolute value of negative 6 is 6. So we do it again. We get x minus 2 is equal to 10, or x minus 2 is equal to negative 10. Because 10 and negative 10, when I take the absolute value, those distances are 10. And I get x is 12, or x is a negative 8. And then x plus 3 equals 16. We write out my two equation, x plus 3 equals 16, x plus 3 equals negative 16. Remember, we always write out my two different equations so that I can solve each of them to say x is equal to 13, or x is equal to negative 19. But what happens if maybe instead of adding something inside of the absolute value signs, we're multiplying outside? Well, I need to get my absolute value by itself before I can split it into two equations. So I need to divide by 3. I'm not going to expand. I'm going to get my absolute value alone so that I get absolute value of x is equal to 9, so x must be 9, or x is negative 9. And so we do the same thing on the bottom one. We divide by 5 and see that the absolute value of x plus 3 is equal to 12. And we write my two equations, x plus 3 is 12, or x plus 3 is negative 12. So that I get x as 9 or x as negative 15. Because both of those, when plugged into the equation, give me the correct distance. A couple more. Okay, same idea with this top left one, divide by 4 and we get absolute value of x minus 2 is 40. So x minus 2 is 40, or x minus 2 is negative 40. Or sorry, this shouldn't be 40, this should be 20 because I divided by 4. So I add 2 to each side and we get that x is 22 or negative 18. All right, now we look at the next one. Once again, I want to get my absolute value alone, so I add 2 to each side. Get the absolute value x minus 6 is equal to 0. Well, if I'm looking for something to be 0 units away from 0, well, then I really just have one equation. X minus 6 is equal to 0. There's not a positive or a negative of that. There's no two possibilities. They're just one. And so we have x is equal to 6. That's the only possibility for getting me my absolute value as 0. And then our last one on this page, absolute value of x plus 4 is equal to negative 8. Well, if we stop and think about this for a second, If I'm thinking about distance away from 0, how could I be a negative distance from 0? The answer is we can't. We cannot have an absolute value giving me a negative number. So actually, there is no solution to this last one. Okay? Because we cannot have an absolute value giving me a negative answer. Okay? And then one more example here. The thermostat is set at 21 degrees Celsius. The thermostat will turn off if the recorded temperature is plus or minus, it should say, 1.2 degrees Celsius of this setting. Meaning my error, I can go above by 1.2 degrees or below by 1.2 degrees from that 21 degrees. What are the maximum and minimum temperatures for this classroom? Now you might be able to do this in your head, say, all right, well then I'm going to add 1.2 to 21 or decrease it by 1.2. But let's set up an absolute value equation to make sure. And in this case, we set up our absolute value equations by saying, I have a certain temperature in this classroom. And that difference from what it should be, 21, can only be 1.2 away. So I set my absolute value equations up like this. I say, I have a certain amount, a value x, and I want the difference from what it should be, in this case 21 degrees, and that's going to equal my error, what I'm allowed to be as far as distance away from that. Okay, so in this case I have my two equations, x minus 21 is equal to 1.2 and x minus 21 is equal to negative 1.2. So that I get a temperature of x is equal to 22.2 and an x value of 19.8, which makes sense. Those are my highest and lowest amounts for the temperature in the classroom. So remember, we set these up by doing what I have, and typically I don't know at all times what I have, minus what it should be, and that equals my error. That's my plus or minus amount that I am allowed to be farther away from that what it should be amount. All right, well, I hope this is helpful for your homework and for studying.